All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to put on our analyst hats and adopt the role of an objective intelligence briefer. Our goal here is simple, to give you the bluff, the bottom line up front, on a seriously complex geopolitical forecast. We're going to apply standard CIA and DIA analytic tradecraft to assess a very specific scenario found in ancient texts. We're talking about the prophesied emergence of a 10-nation global system, something commonly referred to as the Beast System. Now, look, we aren't here to take theological sides or debate dogma. Instead, we're strictly treating the source material as raw intelligence data to map out potential future threat architectures. So let's establish our threat matrix. Think of this ancient text from the Book of Daniel as our raw intelligence baseline, like an intercepted comms cable. It plainly speaks of 10 leaders emerging from a specific global sphere, and then, right after them, a highly disruptive, charismatic leader, an 11th horn, who suddenly pops up and overthrows 3 of those established powers. In the intelligence community, understanding the root parameters of your source material is literally step 1. This intercept is the very foundation of the geopolitical puzzle we're going to objectively break down today. Following standard briefing protocols, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the threat baseline, move into applying analytic tradecraft, then model scenario A and scenario B before wrapping up with key indicators and signposts. Section 1. The threat baseline. Let's look at what the historical and prophetic texts actually say about this confederation. Our primary intelligence sources, particularly the Book of Revelation, describe a final, global power structure as a composite entity. It's kind of like a geopolitical Frankenstein's monster. It's described as having the mouth of a lion, the feet of a bear, and the appearance of a leopard. Now, how do analysts interpret that? Well, geopolitically, it represents a regime that combines the greatest strengths of history's past empires. We're talking about the autocratic majesty of Babylon, the massive crushing military strength of Medo-Persia, the rapid lightning-fast expansion capabilities of Greece, and finally, the iron-fisted legal administration of Rome. It is literally a synthesis of historical tyrannies. Now, sources indicate analysts generally sort this data into 4 main buckets. You've got preterism, which views the threat as localized and completely in the rearview mirror, fulfilled back in the 1st century by Rome and Nero. Then there's historicism, mapping these prophecies continuously across church history. Idealism treats the whole thing as timeless, abstract symbols of good versus evil. But for our purposes, for actual boots-on-the-ground geopolitical forecasting, this explainer is going to rely primarily on the futurism model. Why? Because this system projects a literal future 10-nation global alliance that we can actually attempt to model. Moving on to Section 2, applying analytic tradecraft. Let's get rigorous with this data. To evaluate this impartially and effectively, we can't just speculate. We are actively utilizing the structured, rigorous techniques taught at agencies like the CIA and DIA. We're talking about adhering to directives like ICD-203, which actually mandates the systematic evaluation of differing hypotheses. Using these frameworks ensures we can process and retain critical intelligence rapidly. Okay, let's dive into this specific technique. When you're dealing with an intelligence gap as wildly complex as a prophesied global empire, you need the right tool. So we're pulling straight from the CIA's Tradecraft Primer, using something called alternative futures analysis. You use this when a situation is simply too complex, with way too much uncertainty to trust a single outcome. It lets us systematically explore multiple plausible ways a situation could develop. Today, we're using it to evaluate the 2 most prominent, yet geographically totally distinct, configurations for this 10-nation matrix. Section 3, Scenario A. We're calling this the Roman Revival or the Western Alliance. So, Scenario A forecasts a 10-nation European or Western-centric confederation. This is heavily based on the interpretation of Daniel's famous vision of a statue with 10 toes of iron mixed with clay. Analysts look at that and see an empire that is fundamentally divided, yet politically connected, brittle but strong. Crucially, these member states emerge directly from the historical footprint of the old Roman Empire. They share its cultural and legal DNA. In modern forecasting terms, analysts point to the progressive integration of massive organizations like the European Union or the UN as the potential scaffolding for this exact Western alliance. To really grasp the roots of Scenario A, we have to look at the historicist data. They actually went and mapped out the original 10 kingdoms that fragmented from the Western Roman Empire after it completely collapsed around 476 AD. We're talking about ancient groups like the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Anglo-Saxons, which of course evolved into modern states like France, Spain, and the UK. Futurist analysts take that historical precedent and project it forward. They suggest that a modern, charismatic globalist dictator will eventually exploit a similar, though obviously modernized, Western political bloc to consolidate total global power. All right, Section 4, the Ezekiel Coalition. This is Scenario B, and it's a completely different geographic threat matrix. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can translate these ancient geographic terms directly into a modern geopolitical map. Scenario B is built entirely upon the coalition described in Ezekiel 38. When you run the historical equivalents, a massive, formidable alliance forms. Rosh and Magog correlate to modern-day Russia. Persia is Iran. Meshech and Tubal, that's Turkey. Throw in North African and Central Asian nations, and what you're looking at is a powerful, heavily armed Russian Islamic axis, mobilizing from the north and east, primarily aligned against Israel. 250 million. Let that number sink in for a second. When intelligence analysts look at the combined demographics and conscription capabilities of this Ezekiel coalition, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and all their allies, this number right here represents their massive potential military strength. In any objective threat assessment, a combined fighting force of 250 million troops is an absolutely critical capability metric. You simply cannot ignore it. So the real crux of this analysis is comparing these two models. Scenario A is your Western, Roman revival. It relies on slow, methodical, political, and economic integration. Scenario B, on the other hand, is a rapid, aggressive military axis striking from the east. So how do they intersect? Well, intelligence synthesis suggests a fascinating sequence of events. If that massive Eastern military coalition from Scenario B makes its move and is subsequently destroyed, just as the ancient texts predict, it would instantly create a catastrophic global power vacuum. And it is precisely that vacuum that our charismatic Western leader from Scenario A could exploit, stepping in as a false peacemaker to snatch up total global control. And finally, Section 5, Indicators and Signposts. Now that we've modeled these futures, what actionable intelligence should we be watching for today? The CIA Tradecraft Primer explicitly directs analysts to establish what they call indicators or signposts of change. These aren't vague guesses. They are highly specific, observable events or trends. We use them to monitor targets and provide early warning of a high-impact outcome. It mitigates the risk of strategic surprise. Basically, we need to know what the tripwires are for this system going live. Here are the actual geopolitical signposts derived from our sources. First, watch for an unprecedented, rapid integration of Western states, maybe driven by a sudden global crisis. Simultaneously, keep a close eye on the strengthening military and economic ties between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Look for trigger events that could create that massive global power vacuum. But the ultimate tripwire, the definitive signpost, is the sudden rise of that 11th horn, some previously obscure but incredibly persuasive leader who rapidly, aggressively subdues 3 allied nations to cement his absolute authority. Finally, our sources describe a secondary figure, the beast from the earth. Think of this figure as a technocratic architect whose job is to enforce this new world order. The signposts here are purely technological. The texts talk about an image being given breath. Modern analysts look at that and see the weaponization of artificial intelligence and deepfakes to simulate life. It mentions fire from heaven, which correlates perfectly to advanced satellite or directed energy weapons. Most critically, it explicitly describes a biometric global digital economic tracking system required to buy or sell anything. These technologies provide the literal means to enforce absolute global compliance. So what does this all mean? As objective analysts, we've laid out the threat baseline, applied our alternative futures analysis, and established the signposts. But the critical intelligence gap remains. Which specific matrix is forming right now? Are the political maneuvers of the Western Roman revival our primary threat, or are the heavy military alignments of the Eastern Ezekiel coalition the more imminent danger? The models are built, the indicators are set. It's now up to you to monitor the geopolitical stage for these emerging signposts. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep your eyes open and stay focused.